Neptown Tuner here. I'm just going to go ahead and wing this intake manifold. I've got the little instruction pamphlet here, but I think it just shows you that you're supposed to look online for it. But I think I can probably figure this out. I got the little fittings out and starting to transfer my fuel rail. So I've got a few fittings screwed in here. If you don't want to mar them up, don't be an idiot and use some grippy pliers. Use your plier wrenches with smooth jaws or actual wrenches. But I'm not too worried about marring my fittings. It just adds character, adds patina. So anyway, this thing just has a couple bolts on it. The ones up there up top, T30s, and then you can just pry. What did I use? The idea is you're prying this fuel rail out of these little sockets right here. I thought about maybe doing a different one to show you, but this just pops out, and where it gets a little bit complicated is you can't just bolt the new one in. Why? Because these runners are beefier than these runners. So it hits right here, right here, right here, right here. This all has to be trimmed on the bottom here. So let me push this up here to show you. And actually, it's making these marks. I went ahead and just scooted it across there to see where the marks were. So if we set this in here like so, we're gonna notice that it's hitting and we're not gonna reach our bolts. So this is what it looks like from the top. We got our bolt holes here, and we're just a little bit off because we're hitting on the bottom of those runners all the way across. So I'm just gonna trim the bottom there with that die grinder again. So I'm just gonna kind of wing this, but probably be a good idea to tape off your fuel inlet. You're not gonna get anything in anywhere else before you start shaving your metal shavings. And now I got my rotary grinder here, and I'm gonna start getting at it. Since this fuel rail is separate from the intake manifold, the bolts for the fuel rail, these 4 on the bottom, they just hold this plate that is trimmed on the bottom here. It spans over to the top, and then these 2 bolts help equal the load on that plate. So 5 bolts go in the top, 4 bolts go in the bottom. These 2 small bolts just hold the plate in place until you put the other intake manifold bolts in. But I did have some struggles getting this rail in. First off, there was a big gap here, and I had to basically tap around the whole fuel rail and bend it in before I tried to start drawing it in with the bolts. You don't ever want to draw it in with the bolts, especially since it's hard to get to and you're screwing it into aluminum. So I was taking my hammer and a punch and getting it in here in strategic spots and tapping this into the correct position. But before I did that, I had to make sure that each one of these injectors was properly clocked in that position there, because there was probably a good 3/4 inch gap. And eventually I got it close enough to where I was able to start the bolts, and then I went, side to side, back and forth. That's another thing you always want to do with bolts whenever you're drawing something in. Be real careful. because you can easily strip stuff out in soft aluminum. Can't say that enough. You don't need more headaches. So, got it all bolted in now, and we're off to the next step, which is this fuel line right here. So, you're gonna snake it in from the top here into this hole, and then you're gonna wanna lightly screw it in, and it's not gonna be anywhere close. So what I had to do was I had to just kind of bend the whole thing over this intake runner and get it close enough to where I could start both nuts. You just have to do some strategic bending on both sides, and you don't want to stress this collar nut here. So I got it close enough, and then I started both of them, and that should work perfectly fine. I purchased a new OEM evap purge valve, but for some reason it looked like it was clocked wrong in the factory plastic hose. So I tidied up this purge valve a little bit. You see there's no hanger for it on this manifold. So I just took off the plastic hard pipe and I put on this rubber flexible hose. It wanted to naturally sit right here, and so this isn't up to many people's standards, but it's up to my standards for my own car. I just zip tied it to this hose right here, and then this is where I'm going to be getting manifold vacuum from, and based on my rough measurements, it looks like this will work and be positioned properly. And like I said, this isn't up to most people's standards as well, but this is something that I had. There's a plastic fitting in here, and these hoses fit over top of each other. I'm just trying to get this thing put together at this moment. But this flexible rubber hose goes up into here, and this is where it tees off naturally and comes up right here, and then the turbocharger line is going to plug in right here. Hopefully that lines up pretty good. Got my breather on, got my right angle fitting. This is the same breather mod that I did in a previous video. I was prepping for this engine. Most engines I run, I'm not going to be doing it like this, but with this setup, you'll see. So yeah, that fitting goes in here in the bottom of the manifold, and this evap system just plugs into here. So we got our knock sensor wire right here. These are the two main wires for the intake manifold. And this stuff I'm not using right here is for the runner flaps. And there's another one up here for the position sensor for the runner flap that I just kind of tucked it up into here. And there's another vacuum hose that comes off to the heater core valve, but I think I'm just gonna leave it open. But I simplified it as much as possible. Some of it is still in theory, and I haven't put it into practice. Just mounted this Borg-Warner k04 turbo, and I knew it was gonna be a little bit complicated. First off, there's a little heat shield that goes up here, but I'm gonna keep it off because I want maximum views of Turby. I didn't make a specific video on this one, but on this one I tried the Turbo Smart recirc valve, and we'll see how we like that. Every single one of these hoses and fittings did not fit correctly. I had to bend them and tweak them into the perfect position to make them fit. Most people probably just would have went with AN fittings and universal lines. Even this drain fitting right here, I had to loosen the clamps and cut a little bit of the rubber and then slide the rubber in a different position. But they all ended up working, and they really fit pretty decent, I'd say. You know, I had to trim off the mounts. There's no mounts for them anymore. They don't bolt to the side of the turbo like they used to. Even this back hose right here, I had to trim off the mount and then just bend it into position. Look at this right here, where this hose normally went up to my breather system. This block-off plate was different on this turbo than all the other cars that I have, all the other engines that I have. This, I don't know why, but the flange didn't match up. I was gonna make a custom flange. Maybe I'll grab it. I trimmed the flange off of stock turbo, but the bolt holes don't even line up and the hole doesn't line up. So I just came up with, I had a rubber grommet, and then this is actually a plug from the oil dipstick tube, and it fit perfectly in that rubber grommet to make a nice tight plug fitting. And I trimmed it down to where it's pretty much flush. So we'll see. That's pretty irresponsible, isn't it? But I think it'll work. Most k04 turbos don't have this type of outlet manifold on it. They just have this factory snout. So this one cost extra money. It came with its own downpipe, and the downpipe is slightly different. I wanted to put it on my car before I put the turbo on, but since it's slightly different, the flange didn't mount up to a factory turbo. So what else can I say on this side? Put a new front case on, top case on for the timing cover. I've got a new idler and new tensioner. On this one, I just did the factory rods, OEM upgraded factory pistons that required the 23mm wrist pin. And I just kept the factory bearings in this one. I have the upgraded rods, the forged rods, and the Molly bearings and all that, and I decided just to pass for now. I'll make another engine and I'll test it and probably pass that one on, but for now that's what I chose to do for myself, even though I bought that intending to do JE pistons with either CTS or integrated engineering rods. We'll get that. That's a different video, that's a different rant. Let me continue on this engine. So as you can see right here, we have this pipe going to this elbow, this ECS tuning elbow off this breather. And this breather system is something that I practiced in a different engine in a different video, and it worked perfect to vent right here to the turbo. That's what I did initially as I was pulling it from the turbo on the turbo side. I can't get too off into that topic as well because I could try to explain all that, but anyway, I'll probably have to make another video on this as well. I could unpack all this, but I decided just to put this all together, and maybe I'll backwards go through it because I knew some of this was going to be clumsy and it hasn't even been tried yet. So this is a Venturi fitting, and instead of robbing power from the turbine from Boosty Turby right here and sucking the engine fumes into the engine, I'm just pulling the engine fumes out of the waste side. So we'll see how that goes. It's not near as bad as how the old cars used to be set up, because old cars used to do that. They used to have an actual dump pipe, and it used to create a draft flow at like highway speeds and pull it out that way. Or they just had open breathers on the valve covers. But this specific, I'll talk about it just a little bit because I know I'm going to have people in the comments. This specific setup is actually set up to have its own very intricate blow-by duct on the other side of the engine. It comes all the way up the cylinder head, and then it goes into this oil separator section right here, and it's supposed to create a vortex cyclone deal up here, and it's supposed to drop the oil as much as it possibly can, so all you're pulling is fumes and no oil. We can walk over here to the vacuum pump side, and I don't have the stuff to show you right now, but I gutted the vacuum pump. Since I'm not using, I could go through exactly how this system works, but that's another rant for another time, and I think I've touched on it a little bit in other videos. But since this is direct injected, it was using a vacuum pump system, and I'm going back to the old school style, and I'm using my vacuum for my brake booster. The only thing that I'm going to be pulling vacuum on to start with is brake booster. Eventually, I've got these tapped off. I'm going to look into pulling the other evap line for the fuel tank, or I'll have to look into that a little bit more to figure out exactly what's going on. But there's 2 evap lines. Even though I've got this one still hooked up, I'm still going to use it for the purge valve setup. So this very simplistic setup, and I've got the integrated engineering intake manifold on it now, and that's enough for this video, I guess. We'll try to put this thing in and see what happens. I got the bigger throttle body, and I found myself a coupler for it to go from 3-inch down to 2.5-inch, and I cycled it through its range, but I don't know for sure if this throttle body will work and be happy with my ECU and everything. So we'll see. Hit that like and subscribe.